For nearly half a century, one aircraft alone has dominated the skies. During those years, it has dropped more conventional bombs than any other airplane. With a maximum speed of 650 miles per hour, a range of over 8,000 miles, and capable of dropping 70,000 pounds of bombs, it is the most lethal bomber in the world. It can also deliver nuclear bombs, missiles, and precision-guided weapons. When a United States president wants to wield his big stick, he sends in the B-52s.
When the United States wants to punish an enemy, we send the heavy bombers, and one of those is the B-52.
The B-52 has now become a symbol of more than a bomber. It's a symbol of America's resolve.
Using extraordinary archive film and color reenactments, Battle Stations enters the world of the B-52 Stratofortress. As far back as World War I, the use of aircraft as a means of delivering explosives was accepted as an effective way to strike at the enemy. As aircraft became bigger, so too did the amount of bombs they could drop. With the outbreak of World War II, Adolf Hitler unleashed his bombers, smashing enemy territory in advance of his armies. But as the tide of war changed, it was the Allies who used the bomber to its full destructive potential. With raids of 1,000 bomber aircraft at a time, Allied heavy bombers such as the British Lancaster and the American B-17 proved their superiority by pounding Nazi Germany into submission. Japan, too, was systematically destroyed by vast armadas of American B-29s. In early August 1945, 2 bombs were dropped that changed the face of war forever. And with it, the birth of one of the most terrifying instruments of war, the nuclear weapon. For the first time in over 6 years, the world was at peace. But signs of another conflict were already on the horizon, the growing threat of war with the Soviet Union. The USA began to prepare for hostilities with the Eastern Bloc. On March the 21st, 1946, an organization known as SAC, Strategic Air Command, was established.
There was no office building, so we used offices in the old Martin bomber plant on this airfield. And we start seeing people that we had fought the war with coming from all over the place, mostly all B-29 types.
SAC wanted air combat units capable of flying huge distances and employing the latest and most advanced weapons. But what America did not have was an aircraft powerful enough to meet these intense requirements. With this in mind, the Boeing company began working on various designs for a long-range bomber. These included radical swept-back wings and jet and conventional propeller-powered aircraft. But it wasn't until October the 21st, 1948, that Colonel Henry Pete Worden of the Wright Air Development Center met with Boeing engineers. They arrived with a wealth of documents and designs, but Worden paid little attention to the paperwork and requested a prototype using turbojet engines. He wanted the plans for this new prototype, and he wanted them fast. Pete Worden gave them just 2 days. It was a daunting request, but the team were not going to let Worden down.
We were the ones that had to do it, and we knew what we had to do. And you see, I had all my aeronautical data on the B-55 because I just made a report on the airplane to Pete Worden earlier that week. So we had all the data, but we had to move it into the size of the B-52.
The genesis of the mighty B-52 came about in humble surroundings, in a room of the Van Cleve Hotel in downtown Dayton, Ohio.
It's a classic small-town hotel. I think the Boeing company had a suite on the 7th floor. It consisted of a kind of a sitting room. It had a big round table and a couch. So that was a suite. It was pretty good for the Van Cleve. The first thing we did on Saturday morning is we kind of figured out what we needed to do. We needed some drawings. We needed a performance document. So Vaughn and I, we were the airplane technical people. So we started in on the performance, taking my B-55 data and transferring it into the bigger airplane. And Ed Wells and George Shire disappeared. And at the time, we didn't miss them until they were gone. They came back about 2 hours later with some balsa, and what they'd been out doing, they decided they wanted a model, and they had to go around to the model shops and find the biggest piece of balsa in Dayton, and that set the scale of the model. Shire was the best aerodynamicist in the world, and Vaughn and I were a little upset with him because here we had this massive document to put together, and here he was sitting in the corner whittling a model. But anyway, that's what he did.
Over the following 24 hours, the aircraft began to take shape. It would be an 8-engine jet using podded pairs of the Pratt & Whitney engines. It would have a top speed of 490 knots and the potential to deliver a 10,000-pound bomb load over a range of 5,320 miles. It would also have a radically redesigned wing with a span of 185 feet.
By Sunday noon, we had things pretty good shape, so we called in the secretary of the Boeing office there, Miss Hines, and she typed up all the material that we'd written. The document has a few pages in it.
On the Monday morning, they presented their work to Colonel Warden. He was impressed with the jet-powered plans and asked the Boeing engineers to continue with the design.
wrinkled, kind of like mine, and I thought, this thing can't fly. This is not going to be good. You cannot be serious. You cannot be serious. So I was not a happy camper. Hey. the message, then that meant it was an authentic message. Well, I'm going to try to level the wings, but probably won't be able to. Out on the left wing, I see fire. I look out there, and my number 3 and 4 engines are on fire. And just as I'm looking at that firelight, the second SAM hits the airplane.
Another one coming up off the nose.
Obviously put a pretty big hole in the crew compartment because we had explosive decompression. We lost our pressurization, and the noise was deafening. It was just like you were standing next to a train that was going by on a track at 80 miles an hour. Just deafening noise. Now I look out and the engines aren't just on fire, now the wing's on fire. I'm trying to decide, do we stay with the airplane until that wing snaps? So I thought, I better get the crew out. And the way I did that is there's an emergency bailout light in front of each crew member, and you have a guarded switch which the pilot can activate. And when you hit that switch, it turns that red light on in front of each crew member, and that means eject. It's a kick in the butt when that thing fires, and I thought, this is not a good day.
John Yule was captured by the North Vietnamese and taken to the infamous Hanoi prison camp, nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton. After 3 days of solitary confinement, Yule was on the receiving end of a B-52 bombing raid.
And I can remember being huddled back in a corner of that cell with my fingers in my ears as deep as I could get them, and I just knew my eardrums were going to rupture. And the plasters falling down from the ceiling in the cell, and there are wooden shutters over the bars on the door, and they're like they're made out of cardboard. They're flapping back and forth from the concussion from these bombs. And I'm sitting there thinking, 3 nights ago, I was up there dropping those bombs. The way I'm going to check out is being bombed by my buddies who I was up there bombing with 3 nights ago. Isn't that ironic?
December the 20th was the most intense night of Operation Linebacker. 6 B-52s were destroyed, and 17 airmen lost their lives. After 93 days of captivity, John Yule was finally released. But for him, his savior was the B-52.
That B-52 was such a sturdy airplane, such a tough bird, that it took 2 direct SAM hits, and I was in it for at least 50 or 60 seconds trying to decide whether to bail out or stay with it, and all my crew got out. Everybody survived.
During Linebacker 2, the B-52s flew over 700 sorties in North Vietnam. They kept up the most sustained heavy bombing of the war, dropping over 15,000 tons of ordnance. They destroyed 1,600 military installations, 10 airfields, 500 railway tracks, 3 million gallons of petroleum, and 80% of all electrical power. But for the SAC crews, a high price was paid to complete that objective. Over the 11 days of the operation, 15 B-52s were shot down by SAM missiles. Of the 92 crew aboard these planes, 61 went down over North Vietnam. Roughly half were killed, and half were taken prisoner. Hanoi could not take a further battering, and a ceasefire was signed. In March 1973, the last American troops left Vietnam. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, the B-52 remained the principal strategic heavy bomber in the U.S. air fleet. Constantly updated to incorporate the latest airborne technology, the B-52 was always ready to go into action. On September the 11th, 2001, as it neared its 50th birthday, the B-52 was called on again.
On the 11th of September, we were in the middle of an exercise, and we watched the airplane hit the second tower, at which point we knew then that this was not just an accident, that it was an attack on the United States. So it really hit home at that point that we needed to take the attack back to the enemy.
Their targets were the Taliban extremists, who for 5 years had held the Afghanistan people in an Islamic reign of terror. Home to the Al-Qaeda terrorists, this organization was held responsible for the September 11th atrocities. So began the war on international terrorism.
The B-52 has at least 3 different precision weapons. Those bombs can drop within 40 feet or 13 meters. but we have seen in actual combat that we're actually beating that by a long margin. On the 10th of November this past year, we had an Air Force staff sergeant on horseback in Afghanistan who was under attack. He made a Mayday call. Much to his luck that day, a B-52 orbiting close by was able to direct himself in that direction, and within 8 minutes of being contacted, we laid down 16 of these wind-corrected munitions dispensers, killing about 250 to 300 of the advancing troops, allowing him and his Northern Alliance teammates to escape to fight another day. The mere sight of a B-52 overhead sending a signal to those on the ground that we're here to stay, we're watching, and we're not going to abandon you.
For nearly half a century, the extraordinary B-52 has been at the forefront of US policy in the air. The remarkable range of the aircraft means that from bases in the US, it can strike at targets anywhere in the world.
What a bargain we got as taxpayers. And I don't know of very many airplanes that have been around still flying since 1952.
Current projections are that the B-52 has a combat life until 2045. Almost 100 years of active service. No other bomber in history comes close to this record.
I believe it will probably be the most famous airplane ever, and certainly one with perhaps the longest longevity of any combat airplane that we've ever had in the inventory.
Started in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you know, and now 2000s. So the original designers, give them an attaboy for me because they did a very good job.
Well, I was flying F-86s, and halfway through the F-86 program, found out that some of us were going to be going to the Strategic Air Command and the B-52s, and I was one of the fortunate ones that ended up in B-52. So I was not a volunteer to go to the B-52. I went against my will, but that's how I ended up in SAC and B-52s. And again, the way I looked at it was, I said, okay, look, for the last 4 or 5 years, you've been doing something that you would have paid the Air Force to do. If they didn't have to pay you, you would have paid them. For the assignment I had as a navigator, for pilot training, for flying the F-86, I would have paid them to do it. They were doing just what I wanted to do. And I thought, now I see what they were up to. Those sneaky mothers. They let me have fun for 5 years. Now I'm going to start earning my pay. Now I'm going to start doing something that it's a job. It's not, I don't enjoy this, but it's a job, and I understand that, and I'm committed, so I'll have to do it. No, oh yes I do. I do remember one specific thing about the very first flight. We go out to fly, we taxi out, and we run all of our checklists before takeoff. We're sitting there on what they call the hammerhead, the area just before you go on the active runway. We're sitting there. So I turn around the IP and I say, what's the problem? Why aren't we taking off? And he looks at me and he says, take off? We don't take off until our scheduled takeoff time. Well, I'd been in the Air Force for, what, 5 years, and I had never heard of a scheduled takeoff time before. And all my flying had been, when you're ready to go, you go. When you run the checklist and tower clears you, you take off. Scheduled takeoff time. So we sat there 10 or 15 minutes just waiting for this magic time to arrive, and then we get to take off. So that was that's what I remember about my first ride. I don't remember too much about the airplane, but I do remember later on, as we're going through the training, my pilot, I'm the co-pilot, of course, and my pilot, who is upgrading to pilot, he's been a co-pilot, he's out there getting his upgrade training, and he's great in every respect except refueling, and he is having a lot of trouble refueling. And evidently, my nonverbals to the instructor pilot were, I cannot believe this guy can't refuel. I mean, I'm just looking like, I know I can do this, because this instructor to me said, he said, as soon as I get Vic checked out, you're going to get your shot. We're going to let you refuel. And I thought, great. So the magic day came. Finally, Vic got where he could refuel. So the instructor said, all right, Vic, get out of the seat. You'll get in the seat. And I should have known bad things were going to happen, because this IP seemed so happy about that I was going to get in the seat. So I get in there, and I'll tell you what a nice guy I am. I thought, well, I don't want Vic to feel real bad about his co-pilot driving right in there and hooking up and refueling. And I thought, so what I'll do is make it look like I'm having a little trouble back here before I go in and hook up. Because I'm thinking, this is straight and level in trail. Now in F-86s, I mean, when you flew in trail, you were usually chasing the guy. You were on your back, you were climbing, you were doing everything. So, and it wasn't that tough to stay in when you're flying in trail. And I thought, that tanker's on autopilot. He's maintaining a constant heading, airspeed, everything else. Should be absolutely no problem. I end up almost wingtip to wingtip behind that airplane. I go from supreme confidence, in a period of probably 3 or 4 minutes, I am so confident that I can drive in and hook up. Within 3 minutes, I'm saying, I don't give a damn. I could fly this airplane for 20 years and I'll never learn to refuel it. This is ridiculous. I couldn't get close to that tanker. I was just back and forth, back and forth. I could not stabilize the airplane while I was getting close. And the instructor pilot just loved it. He loved every minute of it. He said, oh, you're doing great. What a wonderful job of refueling. The EW later told me, he said, John, he said, I thought you were going to kill all of us. I thought we were all going to die. He said, I could feel the airplane going through all this thing. Yes, it was, when that klaxon went off, of course, you never knew for sure whether it was a training exercise or whether it was a real thing, and that is true. After a few years of pulling alert, though, and usually I'd say during a normal alert tour, and at the base I was at, that was 7 days, and it varied from base to base. But a 7-day alert tour, you might have 2 or 3, maybe 4 alerts during the week you're on, and of course, obviously, all practice, except they weren't all. This was not a normal klaxon response, that it was really, it was a real thing. Quite an interesting event, for me anyway. We were at a party at the officers club, And in the middle of the party, the wing commander says, all right, everybody go home, go into crew rest, and be prepared. And we knew about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, we knew that it was a high state of readiness for the country. So it was really no big surprise that we were to go into crew rest and to stand by for whatever was going to happen. Well, the next thing that happened was, okay, we're picking up airborne alert along with a lot of other wings that weren't into it right then because of the increased readiness for the whole command. So we take off, I think the second day of the missile crisis. We're airborne on our way on a airborne alert, Chrome Dome. And I'm a co-pilot at this time. And it's about, I'd say 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, out over the Atlantic on the way to Spain to hit the tankers. And the pilot's asleep, I'm up front, and all at once I see a real bright light out in front of the airplane. And we're out over the middle of the Atlantic, and the sky's starting to turn bright. And I thought, oh my God, somebody is dropping nukes. They've already started to drop nuclear weapons somewhere. And those must be, the Russians must be hitting our bases in Spain. That's what I thought I saw. And I get on a radio and I call the number 2 guy. We usually flew in 2-ship cells. I called number 2 and I said, and I think the co-pilot, or no, the pilot was awake. Anyway, I call him, I say, do you see what I see out in front? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, have you heard anything on the radio? Because we should have been getting a message saying, strike your targets. And he said, I haven't heard a thing. And about that time, through this undercast comes a full moon. It was a full moon. But it was undercast below us, and all I could see was this light. I had never felt so relieved in my life when I saw that it was a moon. I'll tell you, I was terrified. I was terrified when I saw that moon before I knew it was a moon, and that sky lighting up when it shouldn't have been lighting up. I just knew that World War III had kicked off. You know, I don't remember, except for the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was very stressful. But the rest of the time, even on the airborne alerts, I don't remember it being that stressful, except, like say, night refueling sometimes, if you were in weather and having to get the fuel at night, and landing at night and weather may be a problem. Other than that, I didn't sense it so much, but I did sense it years later in my civilian job. And when I worked for the United Way, and we'd have a campaign, and there was a dollar goal set, and at the end of at the last week of the campaign, trying to reach this dollar goal, and everybody, all my coworkers would be so stressed out. And I thought, what is the big deal here? You know, so what if we don't make this goal? So what? And you know, to them, this was life and death. And then it finally dawned on me. I thought, you know what? This is probably the most pressure they've ever been under in their lives, is this. And I thought, oh, wow, what a way to go through life. And I told one of them once, I said, you want to know what pressure is? How about being a 30-year-old aircraft commander of a B-52 with nuclear weapons on board, and you got a problem. You got a real big problem. That's pressure. And so at the time, to answer your question, at the time I didn't really think, except for those exceptions I mentioned, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the others. But it wasn't until years later that I looked back on it and I thought, hey, that was some pressure I was under at that time, but I don't recall it now as being that great.
something a missile lacks. Once fired, missiles cannot be shifted to other targets or called back. But no deadlier combination can now be found than the manned bomber married with the missile.